Hello, everybody, and welcome to another great expert interview. Today, I'm honored to have Troy Dunniway on board. He is one of the leaders in the industry with over 20 years of experience in various companies like Microsoft and Co. And he really has worn all the hats that you can imagine, from game designer, game producer, executive, and all these aspects. So he really knows what he is talking about, and he is one of the big minds that we have. And I'm super honored to have him on board today. Part of his work is also teaching, and I hope that he will share some experiences today with us. Troy, hi, and thank you so
Hi
much
there.
for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool. All right. So I would say we jump directly into the topic because we
Hmm.
are super interested in the bridge between game design and game development, and like how is the things interlinked. In development cooperation, we quite often do have a game concept or a vision document, a high concept note, or even a game design document where we have some ideas, where we have even perhaps some core loops and learning content in the game. And now we bring it on to game development studios that actually should do the job in doing the game. And
Hmm.
the question is now, how can we do the bridge from the concept to actually the doing? What are the processes behind?
So the trick there, and why this is really difficult to answer, is that the what we call like a game concept or a game design document or any of these things varies so widely in the industry. There's no standards, right? I've seen GDDs that are finished at 2 pages, and I've seen some that are 2,000 pages. To even show you really quick, I just happen to have it sitting here because I was showing somebody. This is the GDD for Command and Conquer 3 that I worked on, and you can see how thick, 600 plus pages to create, a big design spec, right? And so there's good and bads about these things, like, right? And so this is almost a religious conversation with a lot of people of like, because what happens is if you think about waterfall methodologies versus agile methodologies, right? If you give somebody a big spec like this and say go build this, they're just going to go like, okay, I'll go build this. Whether that's right or wrong, they're going to get halfway through and go like, oh, that didn't work because on paper it sounded great, and then in implementation it didn't. And so when you build and design something and you hand it off to another team, it's really risky, because if that design spec isn't right, they either need to have the freedom to make those changes and go back and forth with you, or if you just say no, do this, you're in a lot of trouble. Like, right, even in the
Yeah.
same company you can have the same problem of a creative leader who's very stubborn and says, here's my vision, go build it. And I see that happen a lot, and the team's like, but that's a bad idea. And he's like, I don't care, go, that's my dream, go build it. And you're like, but it won't work, right? Or
Yeah.
for it could be technical reasons or other things. And so you do have to be very careful about how much do you give. So a really good partner is somebody that should be involved creatively as well, right? So if they're not invested in that creatively, if they don't have some freedom to understand, to find the fun and to figure out what that is with you, or at least to say, even if you're not skilled to do that, to say like, okay, here's what I'm wanting, here's what I need, here's my KPIs for success, like, right, here's what I'm wanting out of it, and then let that developer find the right thing. But you have to kind of tell them like what and why is that important, right? And you have
Yeah.
to be careful to sometimes understand it, if you're the person with the idea, to try to make sure that the developer even understands what that is. A good example, like on Rainbow Six Vegas, when I was first handed that, the way that a lot of game studios work is they'll give you an executive summary. An executive summary is probably 2 to 5 pages, like, right? And they just kind of say, here's this idea. I don't even know who wrote it. Like, somebody just said, here's this thing. They lob it over the fence and they say, go build this. And I was like, go build that? Like, that's a horrible idea. Like, it's not going to work. And I spent like 6 months trying to argue, like, that's not the game we want to make. Like, right. And eventually won. But what was interesting is that they wanted all these casual mechanics. And in the end, what they really wanted was to sell more copies. But they didn't tell me that. Like, right. So early on, I'm like, why do you want it casual? Like, why do you want all these things? And what they were failing to express to me was, we wanted a more mass market game that sold more copies. Like, couldn't you have told me that 6 months ago? Like, I could have worked with that, right? So as that creative team, you really need to make sure, like, what is that development team need to know, right? And so it's not just the design spec, it's about, what are you trying to achieve, what's that vision, what's that final goal, and then sometimes let them find the path through that that's going to make the most sense, right? And then also with budgets and things, you might say like, here's this grand idea, and then your budget comes in, you're like, well, I can actually do this, like, right? Or because it's not if, but when we run out of money, because I mean, no game is ever perfect. We always, things take longer, take more time, take more things. And so if they don't have that leeway and they just try to implement it your way, they often will fail, run out of money, and then the project, goes under, right? And so you either have to have a really, really good game designer, and there's not many of us that can do this, where we can implement a really fairly robust game design that can probably be implemented. But I would say that 80 or 90% of the designers can't do that. Like, it's really not, they need to have a combination of prototyping, MVPs, and these other things along with documentation. And that's why GDDs are never really done to me. They're always a living document, right? They're always something that's evolving. And so you have to be careful that if you give them too much, you're hamstringing them, and then you're causing more long-term problems sometimes. So sometimes it's better to give a vision and let it go versus super detailed. They're just going to try to implement that, good or bad, right? And so that's the danger to be careful of.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think this is speaking about something that I call the melting pot of game design and game development, because like when the game designer comes first, like with a GDD, it can be like 90% done. I also totally agree with the living document, but then we bring in like the game developers and also like perhaps some artists and stuff. And now we have kind of a melting pot where things are evolving, things are iterating. Like the last interview I was doing with Tim, he said we need to find what is the fun in the game. And at the beginning of the process, we just don't know it, and we have perhaps an idea, but we have to test it. And I think in this melting pot where a lot of different opinions come together, there's where the iteration also takes place. But my question to you as like really the expert on this is there a possibility of structuring this, of having like an efficient process of this iteration, testing, improving and stuff, rather than just hoping for the best in a chaotic environment?
Yeah, and so I'm a big believer that I kind of call BS on the people that want to find the fun purely through building interactive, stuff. I've seen teams literally waste 3 or 4 years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to find the fun and never write a design spec, never do anything up front. They just think I need to touch it, I need to feel it. And on all honesty, I would say 90% of those people just don't know what their job is. And I hate to say it that way, but it's designers don't know how to design sometimes. They don't know their craft, and they're just kind of figuring it out. So instead of knowing how to design something and how to think through edge cases, how to think through the problems, they're just like, well, we'll just try it's like building a house without a blueprint, right? You can start building the house, but eventually you're like, well, who's the house for? Oh, I didn't think about that. Like, right. And how much was the house supposed to cost? Oh, I didn't even think about that either. And you're okay, let's tear it down. Let's rebuild it. Like, yeah, you can work that way, but maybe you should stop and do some planning, right? And I feel that game designers that are finding the fun, there was a healthier balance there. Of that doesn't mean that, like, if you talk to Miyamoto or somebody, the running and jumping and the feel of things is important, and some things are important, but it's kind of an 80-20 rule. You need to figure out that 80% of that thing should really be something that people are familiar with, that they know. If you're 100% of your game is 100% unique, you're dead. Like you're not doing a good game, because nobody will know how to play it. Nobody knows how to implement it. And that. So if you can't figure out the basics, you should really know, like, I'm building a shooter plus 1 or 2 things. Like, right. If I'm maybe we call them game pillars or USPs sometimes. So the finding the fun should really just be figuring out 1 or 2 or 3 things, not figuring out 1,000 things, right? And so that's the mistake that teams will do. Or the teams spend so much time figuring out the fun, meaning the pillars, that they forget that it's this death by 10,000 cuts. There's literally 10,000 other features that they just don't figure out how to implement. They never put them in the schedule. Because a lot of this, again, this reliance on agile methodology that they're using, it says don't plan. I know teams that are only scheduled 2 weeks ahead, right? And so they don't know even beyond that. There's no long-term planning. There's no nothing. It's just iterate. oh, out of money. We're go out of business. That's and you're like, you should see it coming. Like, but no, they're too busy iterating, right?
Exactly, and this is exactly my point, because I'm also I'm trying to find a way to structure this kind of chaos of melting pot of iterations towards something that, for me, as a point of view of a project manager that needs to work with
Mm-hmm.
timelines and budgets and all this, how can we actually steer this process?
And so it's tricky, and that's part of not getting into my Creativate tool. But a lot of the reason why I created this new tool called Creativate was to do exactly that, to tackle a lot of these problems, because I think there's inherently a process problem, and there's also inherently a tool issue and other things, like, right. So it's a combination of, one, accountability, making sure that your teams know that, like, you've got deadlines, and those can be slightly flexible, but they need to know that they don't have, if it's a really risky feature that's really hard, don't they don't have a year. Don't go burn a year on something. Spend a few weeks or spend, there. So the production team needs to sort of be hard about, like, look, it's okay to go figure stuff out for a little while, but you don't have infinite amount of time. And
Yeah.
the game industry has gotten really bad about just basically this sunk cost fallacy of, like, we'll spend all our budget and then they'll give us more. And so every team I've ever worked on thinks that way. And it's
Yeah.
just like, if I blow through my budget, it's okay. Because if I spend $20 million, they're going to be like, crap, I don't want to lose that money. So I'm going to go spend it. They'll give me another 5 and then another 5 and another 5, and that's why but every team thinks that way. And that's just the wrong attitude. They should go in there with, like, I'm going to build X, Y, and Z for this price in this time, and it's going to be good enough. And so what they need to be thinking about is how to redesign the product versus saying, here's the design, I'm locked to it, and I'm just going to keep going forward. And, and then everything else just basically means budget and time and all these things keep adapting, versus redesigning and rethinking through the problem of, why are we behind schedule? Well, maybe the game was too big. Maybe there's some features in there that was, too complicated,
Yeah.
or whatever that is. And very rarely do you see teams go back and redesign or figure out how to reduce the design down or reduce the complexity, understanding risk early on, identifying those risks, trying to tackle those first, and then cutting them soon, and running away from the risks, early on, right? And that's
Yeah.
a big part of that process, right? So the paper design gets you a certain way, but you need to know what and risk could be. It's not fun. It could be risk that's hard. Maybe the tech can't do it. Maybe the platform can't do it. Maybe the team can't do it. Like, right. And it's really tricky that way. But even then, like, as game designers, I've seen some of the best teams in the world fail because they wanted to go do something different that they'd never done. And everybody thinks, I'm a game developer. Like, no, you might be a strategy game developer. You're a shooter developer. You're not a game developer, and 9 times out of 10, when a designer or a team switches from one genre to another, they always fail because it's much harder than they realize. There's a certain amount of foundational stuff that's translated, but it's so different. Going from mobile to PC to console, all these things have different rules, right? And so you have to kind of know, like, what are we building, who's building it, and what are the expertise there, and again, identify those risks and try to compartmentalize those quickly, and don't be arrogant about. I think that's a lot of us, this arrogance of, like, oh, I know how to build it. Like, right, I'm a game developer, and I see that from a lot of teams, and they just keep tripping and stumbling and tripping, and they're behind schedule, and they're like, and they're just going to suffer through this because they can do it, and then they fail. And
I think what some very also interesting aspect that you were mentioning, so also total, like, pure gold that you're sharing here with us. But also what I want to elaborate on a little bit was, you mentioned, reducing a little bit of the complexity and understanding the core of the game, which brings me actually to one part of the process where we speak about MVP, so minimum viable
yes.
products, and also vertical slice and prototypes. Can you please tell us what you understand within of these 3 terms, and when do they kick in the process?
So typically there's a bunch of stages that might be considered. Some people may lump them all into a prototype, but there's different types of prototypes, different kinds of things. And so the misnomer is that there's only one of these things. The actuality, like, when I do prototyping early on, so in pre-production, I might do 5 or 10 prototypes, like, right? So I might prototype a specific feature. I might prototype, character, cameras, controls in one thing, put that into a sandbox, as we call it, or put it into a jungle gym kind of thing. So there's just, testing out the character. I might have another one that's a visual prototype that's just going to be, camera fly through, looking through a world that's really pretty. But when you try to combine those together, if you do that day one, you're going to fail because it's trying to risk two things together that really aren't ready to go together yet, right?
Yeah.
And so prototypes, early on should be identifying risky things. If you've built a shooter before and you've built a basic thing and you're using Unreal Engine, just a prototype of a guy walking around a level doesn't prove anything, right? Just building that basic thing. So I've seen teams like literally spend a week and they're like, look, we built the prototype, now fund us. Like, you didn't prove anything. Like, it didn't, prove the risks, right? And that's what prototypes are about. They're about proving risks. And again, that's fun. Or can we do it, in kind of thing, right? And so those early prototypes are about lots of small things, proving different things. And then as we start to go into, say, what we call a beautiful corner would actually be the next one. A beautiful corner is some level of a small, maybe 5-minute experience that generally looks very good and it has some gameplay in it. And that's designed to really start to kind of catch executives. They need to kind of see what the dream is, see what that thing is, and generally might have like one pillar in it, something that's just kind of like, why do I want to continue forward with this, right? So a lot of the publishers and stuff want to kind of see this beautiful corner. And then beyond that, there is typically a vertical slice. So a vertical slice typically is, one level, depending on the game, one area, one level, roughly, let's say an hour of gameplay, like, right? If you're building a 20-hour game, it might be 10% roughly of that thing. That is generally, that MVP is generally the point between pre-production and production, right? So there's a point on most game teams where, assuming we're with a publisher and going through a traditional development cycle, there's a point where they can walk away. There's a point where we need to prove ourselves and say, this is what we need. And in some cases, we may not even get a deal signed until we have that. And so that MVP is important because it needs to really represent, why is this game, going to be great? Why is it fun? Why does it look good? Because the visuals do matter in these things, because most of the executives are very visually orientated. And then, again, why should they keep funding it, right? Or why should they fund it in the first place? And that's really the most important milestone.
Sorry. So MVP and vertical slice you're using for the same part?
So the vertical slice is the first one kind of that's there. And then the MVP is a bigger version of that. So an MVP is basically if you head towards like into production now, the next stage is an MVP. So vertical slice and MVP. MVP would be maybe a 3-hour experience generally has all the core main components in it. Doesn't necessarily mean that's all of it, but you generally have a couple levels, a couple things. And the point of that generally is to say, really to start the testing, to really start to just focus test it, to really start to kind of see, is this what we want to build? So the MVPs in some teams might also be early access or things like that. So depending on the team, that definition of MVP can be a little different, right? And so some teams will try to minimum viable product, meaning it could literally be every feature's done and maybe all the levels aren't done. Maybe they're still polishing and tweaking and stuff like that. But especially like mobile and certain things, sometimes they go from an MVP to launch could take years, like, right? And so they'll sort of be done with the game. They might even start monetizing the game, right? But they're still like not launching live, worldwide, things like that. So there's a lot of different definitions as you start to get past that kind of vertical slice about what does that mean. Open betas, closed betas, alphas, all these things have slightly different definitions. But generally like an alpha is code complete and beta is code and content complete, is general definition. And so an MVP is somewhere in the middle of those, or somewhere, in that realm. And so again, I've seen teams do an MVP after an alpha, and I've seen them do it before an alpha. So it's but the point of like an alpha, if you don't know, and being code complete, is that at some point, like say your game designers, especially your level designers, need to start implementing the stuff and tweaking and testing it. Not, if new systems are coming in too late, you'll never and I see teams do this all the time. They'll throw in systems, like important systems, really late in the game. And then, whole levels have to be redesigned, or or systems don't come in, like, right? So like on Munch's Odyssey, we had to redesign all of our levels about 3 months before we launched, we pretty much had to throw everything out and start over because several of the main systems we were expecting to come in never came in,
I
right?
see.
And so
Yeah,
we hit beta and went like, oh, we're 3 months from launching, and we have no game. None of the
yeah,
levels worked, right?
yeah,
And so we had to literally start over, and stuff. And so that's the problem. If you delay that point too long, that the level design team especially gets hammered the hardest. And that's where, depending on the kind of game you're building, it could make you either get canceled or start. That's when that crunch culture comes in, is that all
yeah,
the stuff starts to hit at the very end. The poor level designers are always the guys that get slammed because suddenly you expected to start building levels 6 months earlier, and you're still waiting for the engine to be finished and the features to be finished and the content to be finished. And you're like, I can't even get started. Sometimes I'm still on paper, like 6 months before the game ships, because the engine's not even ready for me, like, right, to start building levels. And
yeah.
it can be, really tough, right?
And it's so interesting because there's also something that we were discussing in the past, something like a content freeze, or a feature freeze or something like this,
Mm-hmm.
towards a certain point in the process where we say, okay, stop, here's where we are right now, and now we are just doing like polishing, user experience improvement,
Yes. Yep.
VFX, SFX, and stuff like this. Do you see this as part of the reality, or is this content freeze something that is nice in theory, but actually doesn't take place?
I believe it's critical. Like, I think teams that don't do that are kind of crazy. Now, that being said, in today's world, what teams are getting away with more, and to their detriment, is like this idea of live operations, like, right? And so live ops has really changed the way we think in good and bad ways. Like, right. And so again, this adherence to, like, we got to find the fun, like all these things kind of come into the same problem of like, well, I can just push that till later, like, right. So instead of saying no, I can just say not yet, not
Yeah,
now, like, right. And so what starts happening is a lot of teams are like, well, we'll just fix that, like, once we're shipping, once we're done. So that definition of done has changed a lot, because like on the original Xbox and things like that, we couldn't patch, right? So we literally had to go out in a perfect format.
yeah,
And that was really detrimental to us. I mean, we had to really make sure our game was perfect because we couldn't patch it. These days, they're like, oh, we'll just do a day one patch. Oh, we'll just do it, 6 months later after we launch. We'll fix that later. There's this kind of laziness that's
yeah,
happening there. And so I think that's where teams would argue. Again, this is almost a philosophical, religious conversation at some levels, but teams would argue that that's okay. And I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, look at Redfall, look at Gollum, look at so many games this last year that just blew up, tremendously. And in fact, Arcane Studios, if you didn't see the news today, was shut down by Microsoft, and they're the ones who launched that horrible Redfall game earlier in the year. And they literally shot themselves in the foot. They launched a horrible product, because they thought they could fix it, later, and they just kind of had this attitude of like, yeah, we're behind, but that's okay. We'll fix it in a live ops game. We'll fix it later. And it blew up on them. And they literally put them out of business. Like,
yeah.
right. So it's kind of,
That's why I love board games so much. There's no live ops, right? So you
yes.
buy the game and that's it. But okay, nonetheless, so I think there's we're now need to get to an end. If we have like one huge fuck up or obstacle that you would say that we should avoid in this process of like bringing it over, like now moving back to the bridge
Yeah.
concept to game dev, like what is like the biggest mistake that we could do, and what can we do about it?
When you find a co-development partner, so either depending on who you are and building this initial idea, first of all, the best thing you can do is hire a great game designer, like, right, find somebody who's proven and really has experience, and don't just be like, yeah, I can design a game. Like, there's a lot of kind of wannabes that don't really know what it is. It gets even harder if you're building educational type games and things like that. There's very few people that have done that real and done great at it, like, right. So because if you start with a bad idea, it just amplifies all throughout.
Yeah,
Second to that would just be make sure your development partner has a great game design team. And I know I'm biased, I'm a game designer at heart, but it really is. I've seen, I've shipped 140 projects now, and and the vast, and that's not counting all the canceled games, all the other things that I've seen, probably 100 plus games that have been canceled and not made it, even to launch. And most of those, 95% of those were failures because of bad game design. And so so finding a co-dev partner who actually can do great game design is key. And I would say that most can't. And that's been my biggest problem with finding co-dev studios, is it's been really hard to find people that have good engineers, good artists, and good game designers. And that game design has been the biggest weakness. And so so either augment that through find a contractor, there is some guys out there that are pretty good. They're like solo independent contractors, even if you have to hire one of them to augment that other team or whatever that is. But game design's the hardest. And that doesn't mean that art and engineering aren't a problem, but those are things that, especially art, you can easily find more contractors, find other people to help you there. That's more of a, once you get the first one done, it scales okay. Engineering can be a little harder, but Unreal Engine or Unity, pretty robust these days and does a lot. Game design's Wild West and all over the place. And so the biggest advice I can say is just find a great game designer to help you through the process. And that'll, because again, if you just don't start with a great idea, and if you're not able to adjust the idea as you go, and you're just very rigid about it, you're going to fail, right? And the team just won't have the right direction. And so I really can't emphasize that enough, of just, you really have to make sure that that initial idea is solid, but it's also flexible, right? And so that's the key to kind of success. I know it sounds easy, but it's hard when you get egos and you get everything else in there and you get processes. And again, and the other last advice is stop. Sometimes we get so caught on fire. We're like, we got deadlines, we got budgets, we got all these things, and we're trying to do, and we're moving a million miles a minute, and we don't sometimes stop and go like, why are we doing this? Like, right? Why am I making this process? Why am I designing this? Why am I making, and stop sometimes. Sometimes you just need to stop for a week and go like, okay, guys, let's stop, think about, analyze our processes, our pipelines, analyze the game, make sure that we're building the right thing, and then go forward again. But sometimes we're just getting from one deadline to the next to the next. Yeah, and I just see teams fail because they know they're screwed up, but nobody has time to figure out how to unscrew themselves. And so they just end up making it worse and worse and worse and worse. If you get in trouble, stop, plan, think, design, and take a breath and go back into it. But if you just keep staying on fire, you're going to be in trouble, and so that's another thing that teams fail sometimes, because it is like the next deadline. And literally, I know teams are literally like, we're going to get canceled next week if we don't do this. And then the next week, there's another pressure and another pressure and another pressure. The executives are just constantly, crunching you or whatever. And it's just, there's a culture around that, right? So sometimes you got to kind of stop and breathe, and that'll help you reset, right?
This is so interesting because of another point. Perhaps we can do in the future a second round of it, because I absolutely loved it,
of course,
regarding like extrinsic and intrinsic, and like all these deadlines and stuff, like how they're affecting the creativity within the game and the process and stuff. But that's perhaps for something else, some other time. For now, I just want to thank you a million times. It was so great speaking to you, and a real honor to have you on board, Troy, here.
Yep, anytime.
Thanks for sharing everything, and hopefully to do this once again in the future. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful day.
All right, you too. Take care and have a great day.